Chapter 171 The Duke of Evermoon. The Lionheart Kingdom was very strong as a force, not only in the empire it served but in the southern border of the continent as a whole, with one great mage and 2 great knights, 3 grand knights, and 2 grand mages, and several dozen advanced mages and knights in its court. And this was only for the court people knew about on the surface. The old mage in front of Michael just happened to be one of the public grand mages of the kingdom. A day ago, a strong Vana wave that seemed corrupted, like that of the demonic cult members, was sensed by an adventure team who had entered deep into the everlong forest for monsters and natural treasures. It's a rule in the kingdom that any site of the demonic cult should be reported, and as there was a reward based on the significance of the report, most people loved reporting fast without hesitation. This was what happened. However, it was a little tragic as the team of 5 adventurers had planned to investigate more, only to come back with a single member. The other 4 members were sacrificed, but due to the presence of evidence and the fact that even with 2 advanced knights in the team, they were still crushed, the kingdom officials that might have taken a little bit of time to confirm the news had it been reported by mouth immediately ran here. If a team with 2 advanced knights couldn't get back in one piece, then it was obvious a stronger team had to be selected, which was why there was a grand mage this far away from the kingdom capital. I'm Mike. Michael gave out his name, at least part of it. So it's Sir Mike. I'm Grand Mage Leons. Michael's eyebrow raised slightly at the title the other party had given himself. 1. It was either he was blowing his own horns, or 2. He was really that important. Recalling the news he had heard of the Kingdom Knights, Michael felt it was more of the latter. Just as a few thoughts flashed through Michael's mind, he heard the old mage speak again. Are you perhaps also here for the Duke of Evermoon competition? The old mage was quite curious about this. Among all the hired mages starting from his rank, he was the one that went out the most, be it if not summoned. These past few days, he had seen a lot of youths, at least more youths than there was supposed to be in the kingdom, and some of these youths were quite interesting. The requirement for joining the competition for the princess's hand in marriage and the other treasures was first, one has to be less than 25 years of age, and 2, the person had to be an advancing knight or mage. These 2 were tough and strict requirements that one would even rarely find in noble families. This directly screened out a lot of people, making the competition only for the best of the best. It was evident the Duke cared about his reputation, or perhaps it was daughters he cared for, or maybe both, and it could also be for an ulterior motive. However, the youth in front of the old mage was one of the very few extremely powerful youths among all those he had seen in the past few days. Discover hidden content at my virtual library empire. The Duke was shrewd. As one of the 2 most powerful dukes of the kingdom who wanted more power now that the king was stepping down, he wanted to use this opportunity to gain more power for his family. Which ordinary power can grow a below 25-year-old knight or mage? It was almost impossible to see a commoner achieve this with no support, and if he just happened to mess with such a person, it wasn't difficult to manipulate things and take them out. From the start, the competition was never fair. Most people realized this, and there were also some that didn't. Hearing the words of the old mage in front of him, Michael didn't take long to respond. I came to give it a try. However, I'm not from around here, so it's hard to reach the place where the contest will be held, Michael stated. He had listened to quite a lot in the bar, and one thing he had heard was that a certain duke was holding a competition with the hand of his daughter in marriage as the prize, and so on, and other people from outside the kingdom were attracted to it as well. And technically, though he wasn't attracted or interested in the competition itself, he was curious about it. And he was indeed not a native of this place, so technically he wasn't lying, except for the part he said he wanted to try it. The mouth of the mage twitched when he heard Michael reply. Since the Duke wasn't interested in the throne itself but more power than can be gotten during these times of crisis, the other princes that were also aiming for the throne were after his daughter, and they were certainly not in it to try. But after thinking about it for a while, the old mage felt it made sense. A 20-year-old grand mage. He had the arrogance to take the competition as fun. However, this young genius seemed to be a little slow about the ways of the world. Maybe this is his first real experience outside, the old mage thought. And technically, he wasn't wrong. Tonight was indeed Michael's first time exploring in the land of origin, at least in its civilization. Chapter 172 Familiar Sight. Just as the two exchanged words between themselves, silence reigned for a moment. The old mage was about to say one last thing before leaving when suddenly he and Michael turned to look in a certain direction. "What's that?" Michael thought, a slightly serious expression on his face, while the old mage, not too far from him, had an extremely serious expression. A distance away from them, they could sense the use of magic being cast in a chaotic manner. From afar, it also seemed like a mass of chaotic mana was rushing toward them. The old mage turned to look at Michael and spoke. His tone was grave and serious. "See you next time, Sir Mike." "I'll be leaving first," said the mage. Immediately after speaking, Michael saw the mage raise a finger and stretch out his wand slightly. With a finger moving in the air as he drew a magic circle, Michael watched as a magic circle seemed to appear out of nowhere above the stretched wand. If it wasn't for the fact that Michael saw the veins on the body of the wand light up, he would have really thought those magic circles had appeared out of thin air. So it's possible to eliminate drawing magic circles with gestures. Michael didn't know if his suspicion was right despite what was happening in front of him. Even the human mage in his storage ring now, despite casting spells at an extremely fast pace, Michael was sure he had caught the other party using hand gestures for the spells. However, the old mage in front of him, for one, the mage was still using a hand. But on the other hand, the magic circles that appeared in midair formed faster than the blurring movements of the old mage's hand. Doesn't this mean that there's a chance that drawing magic circles by hand will not exist in the future? Then what will be the use of agility to a mage? Just to dodge. Michael felt his suspicion might be spot on. Perhaps, at the start, agility did help in spellcasting, but in later stages, it contributed more to the survivability of a mage. The mages dealt heavy damage. Even the fast spell casting of the mage in front of him at his stage still took at least a second. A lot could happen in a second at a certain stage. Though several thoughts flashed through Michael's mind in an instant, his eyes never left the movements of the old mage. The moment the magic circles were cast, which was barely a second, they disintegrated into pieces and enveloped the old mage's body, coating him in some sort of aura. Immediately after this happened, the mage's body started to float, and after giving a glance, he levitated away into the sky in a flash. The sight gave Michael a shock. However, it also made him confused. The mages in this world can't fly naturally like they do in Aurora. Michael wondered. However, a second later, he cleared the thought from his head. The only flying supernatural he had encountered in the real world was Brian, whom he suspected was a Kingring cultivator. The other party's ease of flying didn't mean that supernaturals ranked below him could naturally do the same. He still needed to see more supernaturals in the real world to understand their power system better. The methods used to gain power and cultivate in the real world were said to have come from the land of origin, but it seemed those methods were probably not applicable, at least not in the region Michael currently was. That was not unexpected. The land of origin was vast, and it was said that there were several continents, each with their own practices and history. Explore hidden tales at my virtual library Empire. Two people could know themselves extremely well for years in the real world, yet be nowhere close to each other in the land of origin. At least, that's what Michael had read in the land of origin, but a part of him believed it to a certain extent. Seeing the old mage flash further and further away in the air from his location, Michael only thought for a brief moment before his curiosity took over. With the mindset of, "I'll just check it out and then leave," Michael ran after the mage, or rather, trailed behind the old mage as they both headed in the direction of the mass of chaotic energy and magic. As he trailed behind the mage, Michael made sure to keep himself hidden and not blatantly expose himself. He didn't think this would escape the senses of the old mage, as he wasn't using any profound art to mask his presence. It was merely a subconscious action one did when they knew they were doing something they probably shouldn't be doing. As for why Michael didn't fly alongside the mage, there was a reason for that. Though he couldn't fly yet, Michael had an undead that could. But it was exactly because of the identity of the undead that he was unwilling to reveal it outside to the old mage. For one, the other party seemed to have become acquainted with him, and Michael wasn't willing to lose that. It was especially significant to him because this was his first contact in the land of origin, and one that would probably fasten his integration into this world. With his lack of knowledge of how this part of the land of origin might perceive undead, Michael wasn't willing to risk it. To a man with great senses like the old mage, who had even sensed the uniqueness of his aura without him unleashing it at first, it was a stupid act to think the appearance of this undead would be able to hide the signs of their lack of life in their body. Even if he could tell which body had life and one that didn't, with the old mage who seemed to have decades of experience to boast about, Michael didn't want to risk anything if not necessary. For now, if he needed to fight, then there was no difficulty in playing the part of a spearman for a while. But if he really needed to summon an undead, Michael didn't mind the opinion of others if his life was at stake. It didn't take long for Mage Lian and Michael to arrive at the location they were sensing the mass of chaotic mana from, and the sight left them in shock. Mage Lian's shock originated purely from the sight in front of him, while Michael's shock originated from fear, a traumatic experience that was subconsciously buried deep in him appeared for a moment. Though he wasn't close and was a little far away, Michael could see a large amount of monsters attacking a 20-man group of men in armor. Based on their movements and fighting style, Michael estimated that the men were probably all elite rank 2, superhumans if compared to his world, based on his experience. However, the monsters they fought all seemed to be early commanding creatures, which was not only stronger than many in the group, but also outnumbered them. If it wasn't for the use of magic, which Michael could see from the lesser-armored, dressed men who use magic, if these people were taken out, the group would have been less than half in a few minutes. However, this wasn't what shocked either Mage Lian or Michael. It was the monsters, or rather, the appearance of the monsters. The monsters all had tendrils growing out of their bodies, making them look exceedingly bizarre and wrong, not odd, but wrong-looking. At first glance, it was creepy. If Mage Lian was shocked by the sight below him, Michael felt a little fear of the sight ahead of him. It wasn't fear of the monsters, though they looked difficult to handle. If Michael was left alone with them with his undead, he didn't think it would take long to clear them off. What made him feel fear was the tendrils growing out of the monsters' bodies. It immediately reminded him of the monster that had almost taken his life in the Black Tower in the ruins that served as his initial location in the land of origin. As Michael watched the scene from afar, he saw Mage Lian in the air start emitting a huge amount of mana from his body. Immediately, Michael could tell the other party was about to cast a spell, and not any weak one. Several magical circles appeared in midair around the old mage in the sky. For a moment, Michael thought the construction of the magic circles felt a bit familiar, and it was just as he thought when he saw the effect of the magic circles when they were activated. Fire spear. Descent. A low roar echoed in the surrounding area, and Michael watched as rows of fire in the shape of spears fell on the monsters below. Soon, what followed was the sound of explosions. Chapter 173. What happened? Powerful. That was the only word Michael could use to describe Mage Lian's display of magic. He had seen Fire Spear before from his undead mage, but that one could only conjure two at most. In contrast, Mage Lian summoned several with ease. His mastery level must be advanced, maybe even close to perfect, Michael speculated. He wasn't entirely sure what perfect mastery looked like, as he had never witnessed it himself. However, it was said that at perfect mastery, a spell underwent a transformation, significantly enhancing its effects. While Mage Lian's magic was undoubtedly skillful, it lacked that transformative quality, leading Michael to believe it was at the advanced level. That, or the spell itself was of such a high grade that it appeared to be mastered at a higher level than it actually was. With such power, wiping out weaker monsters was effortless for Mage Lian, no matter how many there were. However, his magic took a toll on the forest, leaving destruction in its wake. As Mage Lian slowly descended from the air, Michael hesitated for a moment before stepping out of hiding. The mage turned to look at him but quickly shifted his gaze away. There was no hostility in his expression, which gave Michael some relief and the confidence to approach. Initially, he had planned to keep to himself after satisfying his curiosity, but the sight of those familiar black tentacles on the slain monsters unsettled him. It made him uneasy. He had no concrete evidence, but he was almost certain they were connected to that monster. Had he unknowingly unleashed something very dangerous? Even though he had been growing more self-conscious lately, it didn't mean he had abandoned his previous values. As he drew closer to the 20 knights, several of whom were barely standing, his sharp ears picked up on Mage Lian's conversation with one of them, a man who appeared to be their leader. What happened here? Did you catch the monster that attacked the adventurer team? Was it the one responsible for all this? Mage Lian questioned in rapid succession. The knight, struggling to remain upright, took a deep breath before speaking. Lord Lian, we did see the monster, but it wasn't alone. His voice wavered, and before he could say more, his body gave out, and he collapsed. Mage Lian frowned but didn't press him further. Instead, his gaze shifted to another knight, one who looked just as exhausted but was still standing. You, tell me what happened. Yes, my lord, the knight answered. Though clearly drained, he had managed to catch his breath for a few seconds. Whether it was the brief respite or Mage Lian's more measured approach this time, the knight was able to recount everything that had transpired. Michael, now standing in plain view of the 20 knights, listened intently. Some of them regarded him warily, but none acted against him, likely because Mage Lian had shown no sign of disapproval at his presence. Aside from using detect on the knights, Michael paid them little attention and instead focused on Mage Lian's conversation. The knights' levels ranged from 16 to 19, with the first knight Mage Lian had spoken to being level 22. By checking their names with detect, Michael confirmed that the first knight was indeed the leader of the group. No, there hadn't been just 20 men. Originally, they were a force of 50. The 20 present were merely the survivors. According to the second knight, their mission had been to hunt down a special monster, one powerful enough to warrant dispatching a team from the capital. It was a threat beyond what most people could handle, and their journey had taken them this far from the kingdom's heart in pursuit of it. The Everlong Forest was a unique location in the Lionheart Kingdom. For one, no one had ever seen its end, or rather, only those at the level of a Grand Mage or Grand Knight might have. Only individuals of such strength would dare to venture deep into its unknown depths. However, it was precisely because of this mystery that the forest was well known among adventurers. Powerful monsters were not rare within its depths, and the deeper one went, the stronger they became. Those confident in their strength, or those seeking the treasures hidden within the bodies of these beasts, often ventured into the forest, making it a prime destination for the bold and ambitious. Despite its allure, the entrance near Blackstone Town remained largely unpopular. The town's remote and underdeveloped location did little to attract adventurers, especially since the everlong forest stretched far and wide, with multiple points of entry across the kingdom. With no special features to set it apart, Blackstone Town was often overlooked. Not wanting to linger in this backward town after living in the capital for so long, the 15 knights, confident in their strength, wasted no time and charged into the forest in search of their target. And they found it. A massive humanoid monster covered in writhing black tentacles. Even from a distance, the aura it exuded made their hearts tremble. It was worse than anything they had ever felt, even more terrifying than the presence of the grand mages or knights they had encountered before. Instinctively, they knew this was not a monster they could handle. Even the grand mage accompanying them wouldn't stand a chance. They decided to retreat. But before they could slip away, the monster turned. A single, piercing screech shattered their resolve. Dizziness overwhelmed them, but that wasn't the worst of it. What truly horrified them was when nearly a quarter of their own men suddenly screamed in agony and turned against them. Betrayal in their eyes, weapons drawn. Then, as if summoned by that terrible screech, monsters swarmed in from every direction, attacking relentlessly. By some stroke of luck, the massive creature itself did not move to attack them directly. Yet the chaos it had unleashed was enough to almost wipe them out. No, it would have wiped them out had the Grand Mage not arrived in time. Even so, the fact that the Kingdom Knights had managed to hold out for so long before help arrived spoke volumes about their strength. Michael and Mage Lian listened in silence, their expressions dark and serious as the second knight recounted the nightmare they had barely survived. Michael felt a storm of emotions, concern, fear, anxiety. He didn't know how long he lingered on each, but he felt them all. The monster doesn't even need to attack directly to cause devastation. And not only did it move from its original location, but it also seems to need bodies. Because if what the knight said is true, then every time one of them died, a monster would carry the corpse away. Wait. Michael and Mage Lian's eyes widened as realization struck them at the same time. If the monster's minions always retrieved the dead, didn't that mean it was still watching? Even from afar, it knew exactly what was happening here. The moment that thought clicked, a chilling screech pierced the air. Their hearts sunk. Instinctively, they turned their gazes skyward, and their expressions darkened. A massive flock of creatures loomed above, blotting out the sky. The huge, black, tentacle monster was nowhere in sight. But that didn't bring even the slightest relief. Dozens, no, hundreds, of eagle-eyed beasts circled above, each radiating an aura dangerously close to First Knight's own power. And they all shared the same disturbing trait: black tentacles writhing across their bodies. Continue reading at my virtual library empire. One look was enough to confirm it. These creatures were no different from the monsters Mage Lian had just killed. Sir Mike. Mage Lian's urgent voice snapped Michael out of his shock. Please assist me in bringing these men out of the forest. I assure you, the kingdom will reward you heavily. His grave tone carried weight. But what truly surprised the exhausted knights was the fact that he had asked Michael for help in the first place. Though they could tell Michael wasn't ordinary, they struggled to understand why someone younger than them, by at least half a decade to a full one, would be asked to assist in such a dire situation. After all, Michael hadn't shown any obvious display of power. Michael was about to mentally refuse when he hesitated. Isn't this an opportunity to integrate myself into this world? There was no better way to build trust than by helping people in their time of need. His experience in the real world after the chaos, and even before, had taught him that much. But was it worth risking his life for these people? There was no sign of the true monster controlling these creatures, but that didn't mean it wasn't nearby. From his previous experience, Michael knew that thing could truly kill him. He hesitated, weighing his options. However, the monsters above made the decision for him. With a screech, the eagle-like monsters in the air all started to attack. In fast movements, they dived down at the people below. Chapter 174 Escape. Since they were due far away, Michael couldn't use detect on the eagle-like creatures. But from the aura they gave off, he could tell they were all still rank 1 monsters. None were close to rank 2. Individually, they didn't seem difficult to kill, but with hundreds of them in the sky, the sight was terrifying. Like they say, even ants can kill a lion, let alone a swarm of magical beasts. At that moment, Michael made his decision. Explore more adventures at my virtual library empire. Wasn't it just about keeping most of them alive while ensuring his own survival? Then he'd do it. But that was as far as he was willing to go. However, if he truly wanted to save these people, there was one thing he needed to do, and that was to summon part of his undead for assistance. Alone, he'd only be putting himself at risk. But with his undead, he wouldn't have to take direct action. Still, a question lingered. What would be the reaction of the people around him when they saw his undead? Michael only hesitated for a moment before making his decision. If their reaction was bad, it was better to find out now while he was still on the outskirts of civilization rather than later, when he was deep inside it. If he ever found himself surrounded by powerful figures and forced to use necromancy, which was forbidden in this region, then Michael knew he'd be looking at a permanent 10% reduction in his stats in the future. Since he had made the decision to show a bit more about himself while taking the effort to make this group of people feel something, at least even if it was just gratitude towards him, Michael went all out at the start and summoned Lucky, his strongest undead. A magic circle appeared in front of Michael, and the huge appearance of Lucky emerged from it. Following its appearance, several huge green vines erupted from the ground, charging at the black eagles descending from the air. With the instructions given by its master upon summoning, Lucky made sure to avoid any harm reaching the group of people around it, including its master. The sudden appearance of the green vines erupting from the ground shocked the group of 20 knights who still had their consciousness, including Mage. Immediately, they all turned to look at Michael's location. No, rather, they all turned to stare at the monster closer to Michael, whose presence made their hearts squeeze in fear. Mage, who had worn an expression of extreme seriousness on his face earlier, now had it replaced with shock. As the Grand Mage of the kingdom, though he knew there were existences stronger than him in this world, like the great knights and mages of the kingdom, he had never considered himself weak. Or rather, only a few beings were capable of making him feel weak. However, he never thought that he would encounter such an existence again. When he had called for help from Michael, it was because he had acknowledged him as someone with a certain level of power worthy of respect. At the very least, the fact that the young man could contain such power at his age was something to respect. However, even though Michael gave him the feeling that they could be equally matched in battle, Mage still thought very highly of himself. After all, he was an individual who had lived for more than 150 years. The experience that came with several decades of battle wasn't something that talent could always override. However, now, in front of Mage very eyes, was the sight of someone he had barely considered an equal showing his fangs for the first time. An undead. No, he didn't have any other person with him before. This was the thought that ran through the minds of the more knowledgeable people around. Though Lucky gave them a feeling of immense strength, the ones with better sensitivity felt a heavy lack of life from its presence. It was dead. Creatures like this were called undead, and those who controlled them were called necromancers. In the kingdom and the empire as a whole, the use of undead was not banned, merely frowned upon, but necromancers were still discriminated against due to their nature. However, what all necromancers had in common was that they always kept their undead close. That was the issue. Michael had always been alone. So where did the undead come from? He's a summoner, was the second thought that ran through their minds. There was no better way to explain this, nor was there time to consider it, as they were all currently in the midst of danger. The first side to suffer a loss at the start were the monsters. The black eagles that were at the front were the first to die from Lucky's vines. However, to Michael's surprise, who had expected the black eagles to continue charging forward even at the sight of their fellow monsters' deaths, just like the monsters that emerged from the cracks in the real world, all of these ones actually stopped and flew upward. Though not all of them were able to escape from the range of Lucky's skill, a good number of them still managed to. For a moment, both monsters and humans stayed still and did nothing. That was until Michael spoke, snapping the people on his side out of their shock. Are you going to stay there and do nothing? The loudness and tone of his voice jolted the Knight group and Mage out of their daze. Finally recovering, Mage immediately took control again. For the ones that are able to walk and have strength, carry those that cannot or have fallen unconscious. We leave no comrade behind. We leave. The commanding voice seemed to ignite a new surge of strength within the group of knights, who immediately followed the order. All of this played out under the watchful eyes of Michael, who still had his attention locked on the monsters in the sky. Those are black eagles, advanced-level monsters whose attacks are purely physical. They live in large groups. If your summon can hold them off, we should be able to escape the forest. At some point, Mage had appeared close to Michael and started speaking to him about the characteristics of the monsters above. Advanced level, summon. Michael was unable to fully grasp the implication of these two terms until a moment later. Advanced level. Is this a way of classifying the strength of creatures in this part of the world? And summon. They think Lucky is a summon. This much was what Michael could gather from the words Mage had just spoken. However, he was uncertain whether his assumptions were correct. Unfortunately, this wasn't the time to ponder these things, so after giving a nod and a hum to Mage words, Michael continued keeping his eyes on the monsters above. Strangely, after their first loss, the group of monsters didn't immediately attack. They just hovered in the sky, glaring at the group of people below. They also did nothing, even when Michael and the group of 20 knights, plus Mage began to retreat. They simply maintained their stance in the sky. However, what made Michael nervous was that he could constantly feel some sort of gaze on him, one that made him feel very uncomfortable. He felt he was being paranoid, but something told him that monster was probably staring at him right now, even though there was no sign of its body in the environment. All of this made Michael want to leave the forest quickly. Fortunately, this was the same feeling the others had, as they all hurried their retreat. Like before, the group of beings in the sky did nothing but stare at them as they retreated. It wasn't until the group had moved a little further away that the monsters dived down again. However, this time, it wasn't for Michael and the people around him, but for the monster corpses on the ground. Using their claws, they swooped down, grabbed the bodies of their fallen companions, and then flew back into the sky, retreating deeper into the forest. All of this played out before the eyes of Michael, who was retreating with a group of knights and Mage with Lucky beside him. Though there was no evidence, Michael was certain these monsters were taking the bodies of their fallen companions to that monster. In a way, it proved that the mysterious monster seemed to be in need of bodies. For what reason, they did not know. However, regardless of what it was, at least they were able to escape, and that was what mattered most. The moment the group emerged from the forest, Michael unsummoned Lucky, sending him back into the netherworld. However, no one stopped, and they continued moving toward the walled settlement. Michael could have separated from the group, but wouldn't that defeat the entire purpose of saving them? With an attitude like he was one of them, Michael simply tagged along. Chapter 175 Conversation in the Mayor Office. It didn't take long for the group to reach the center of the settlement. This was Michael's second time here, and also the place where he had his first interaction with Mage. Not only was the central section of the settlement better maintained, but it also housed several important establishments, like the one standing right in front of Michael, the town mayor's manor. Among all the buildings in town, it was one of the largest and most luxurious. When he first laid eyes on it, Michael hadn't expected that its owner would end up serving him this very night. Truly, some things just happened. Looking at the group of injured knights, who had left strong but returned confused, the mayor of Blackstone Town didn't hesitate to mobilize all available staff to attend to the kingdom's knights. Serving Mage was a given, an honor, even. Continue your saga on my virtual library empire. However, what conflicted the mayor was Michael. He had never seen this man before, nor did he know anything about him. But seeing how the Grand Mage treated him as an equal, and how the knights who had ventured into the forest looked at him with awe, it didn't take much reasoning for the town mayor to realize that this was an extremely important figure. What he didn't know, and would have never guessed, was that while Michael was indeed highly regarded by Mage, it wasn't because he was the son of some noble family. It was because he was just as strong as some of the most powerful individuals in the kingdom. Of course, the mayor couldn't be blamed for reaching his conclusion. Even Mage still believed Michael came from a noble lineage, as his current strength wouldn't make sense without strong backing. Unfortunately, this was Mage first encounter with an Awakener. Had he met Michael's peers, those who were capable and had awakened years earlier, he would have been even more shocked. Since there were no mages capable of healing magic, but a few health potions were available, the injured knights could only roughly bandage themselves, stabilizing their condition and removing themselves from immediate crisis. However, to fully recover, they would need to return to the capital. After this, only a few would continue serving as knights, making the casualties even more significant for the kingdom. Though there were other knight teams like this one, cultivating these 50 strong men wasn't cheap. Aside from this, we might need to report this to the great knights and mages of the kingdom, Grand Mage. After settling into the town manor, Michael, who had expected to be placed in a separate room or somewhere else, was unexpectedly led to the office of the town mayor, where they were discussing the recent issue. Mage and Michael were offered seats, while the mayor stood by Mage side as they all listened to the words of the knight captain, who had recovered slightly thanks to his amazing natural recovery rate. When the knight captain spoke, he was a little anxious, careful not to say anything that might displease Grand Mage. After all, despite their different supernatural professions, the other party was still his superior, and if he wanted to ruin his life, it would be as easy as cleaning one's tooth. Saying they needed someone stronger could easily offend him, which made the knight captain feel even more nervous. Fortunately for him, Mage wasn't that petty. You were right. We'll need at least that level of power. This monster isn't just special, it's extremely powerful. I wouldn't dare say I could take it on myself, Mage stated with a serious expression. To be honest, this was just him saving face. Though he was recognized as a grand mage with godlike abilities in the eyes of mortals, only Mage and his peers knew the true extent of his power. He was strong, but within his rank, he was still just at the beginning. Even so, his power was still rare, and few could compare to him. However, had it not been for the young man beside him, though Mage was confident he could have survived, he didn't dare say things would have ended as perfectly as they had, thanks to the young man's assistance. Thinking of this, Mage turned to look at the youth seated beside him, who had a contemplative expression on his face. If this man truly joins the Duke of Evermoon competition, he will either win easily, or if there are people capable of stopping him, the entire kingdom, and even beyond, should prepare for the year of their lives. Mage Lian couldn't help but think back to the wolf the youth had summoned. He had no doubt that creature was at least as powerful as him. No, it was far more powerful than him. If Michael were to hear Mage Lian's thoughts, he wouldn't be surprised. Though Lucky wasn't yet a rank to existence like Mage Lian, as an extra-ranked creature, it was just as strong as one. If Mage Lian could match Lucky's undead prowess at his level, it only meant the other party was special in his own right. With his vast experience, Mage Lian could tell that the energy radiating from both Michael and Lucky felt a lot like necromancy. Yet, despite living for over a century, he had never seen a necromancer summon their undead from nowhere. They always carried them everywhere. However, he was aware of special undead existences that had nothing to do with necromancers. Having one as a summon was the most plausible explanation he could deduce from what he had seen. In any case, whether the youth had ties to necromancy or not, one thing was certain: he was undoubtedly strong. Is there anything Sir Mike would like to input? Immediately, all eyes turned to Michael at Mage Lian's words. Among them, the one most curious about Michael was the town mayor. As someone who had secured his position through connections, he prided himself on knowing of every noble, even those he had never met and likely never would. But this Sir Mike, who was he, to be treated on the same level as Mage Lian? It wasn't the only type mayor who was interested in Michael's identity. In fact, all the knights Michael had saved were interested in this mysterious youth identity. Unfortunately, they were warriors of the kingdom, so they were even more doomed to not know Michael's identity. In fact, anyone was doomed already the moment they thought Michael had an identity. Michael raised an eyebrow in surprise. He hadn't expected to be included in the conversation. In fact, he was surprised they even allowed him to listen in the first place. Though he had been the one to rescue them, given the nature of the situation, it wouldn't have been odd if they had excluded him entirely. But they hadn't. Though confused, Michael was naturally pleased. This gave him a chance to familiarize himself with the people of this world and integrate better. What concerned him, however, was the identity they seemed to be assigning him. From his observations, it was a fitting one, but also one that could turn against him later. And for some reason, Michael had a strong suspicion that it would. Still, since he had already stepped onto this path, there was no turning back. In any case, he had told them from the beginning that he was no exalted figure, yet they refused to believe him. That wasn't his fault, was it? "Thank you for considering me," Michael said, his tone even. "But this is an important matter best left to those in charge." Mage Lian gave a short nod in response. He had expected this answer and wasn't surprised. Not that he would have been if Michael had chosen to speak, either. Given his role in the incident, it wasn't unreasonable to offer him a voice in the discussion. Of course, listening was one thing. Whether they acted on his words was entirely up to them, the true subjects of the kingdom. Seeing that no one else was going to speak, Mage Lian took control of the conversation once more. "Regardless of what happens next, we need to reach the capital soon. Leaving that monster unchecked could result in many casualties. At the very least, a town this close is in grave danger." At those words, Michael glanced at the mayor and saw the man swallow nervously. Mage Lian wasn't finished. "Fortunately, we now have more knowledge of that creature's power. The loss of Lionheart's brave soldiers was not in vain." As he spoke, Mage Lian turned to look at the knight captain, who seemed like he was on the verge of tears. Chapter 176 Reflection. Even in a fantasy world, being praised by a superior was a satisfying feeling. After years of training under the kingdom, most knights accepted the idea of dying for their homeland. However, that didn't mean they were mere puppets. If they had to give their lives, most at least wished it would be for a just cause, one where their sacrifice was acknowledged and appreciated. Mage Lian wasn't finished. "Though we can't retrieve the remains of our fallen warriors to lay them to rest, or give their families the closure they deserve. I promise you this, it won't be long. Their sacrifice will not be in vain." His words carried weight, and the knight captain gradually calmed down. He straightened his posture before giving a salute, a small smile forming on his face. "It's our duty to die for the kingdom if needed, sir. I'm sure my brothers up there would agree with me." "Ha ha." Mage Lian gave a firm nod. "Emichum, return and rest up. Try to calm your other teammates. We leave at daybreak tomorrow, so use this time to recover your strength." To be honest, Mage Lian would have preferred to leave immediately. However, it was already deep into the night, and if any unexpected variables arose during the journey, it could lead to unnecessary complications. It was safer to rest, regain strength, and travel at first light. After dismissing the knight captain, Mage Lian turned to the mayor, who was now standing respectfully with his head slightly lowered. "Grand Mage." The mayor hesitated as if unsure how to continue. Mage Lian cut him off before he could speak further. "No need to say more. You are worried about the monster being too close to this town, aren't you? But there's no need for concern. That creature won't leave the forest. At least, not anytime soon. Still, make sure to stay on guard." Truthfully, Mage Lian was merely speculating. For some reason, he felt like he had been bullshitting a lot tonight. Experience news stories on my virtual library empire. However, based on his own observations and the knight's reports, the monster didn't seem interested in leaving the forest. Or perhaps, it couldn't leave the inner regions of the Everlong Forest. Whatever the case, it was good news, not just for him, since he had no confidence in confronting that creature, but also for the townspeople. That said, there was no guarantee the monster wouldn't leave the forest eventually. There was also the possibility that it might send its minions to attack instead. Either way, staying vigilant was the only logical course of action. The mayor, knowing there was little he could do about the situation, could only nod in acceptance. With the conversation at an end, he offered to escort both Mage Lian and Michael to their rooms for the night. Michael didn't refuse. Unless he wanted to head back into the forest, which he definitely didn't, staying within the mayor's residence was the best option. There were several strong individuals stationed there, making it a much safer place to rest. As for his undead left behind in the forest, Michael planned to resolve that issue during daybreak in the land of origin. For now, he had no intention of heading out into the night, even if his vision far surpassed that of regular people. Upon entering the room assigned to him and thanking the mayor, who repeatedly insisted it was his honor, Michael closed the door. The room was one of the many guest chambers in the mayor's residence. Given the mayor's status, anyone allowed to stay under his roof had to be someone of importance, and the room's design reflected that. The bed was far wider than anything Michael had back in the real world, though its comfort level remained unknown. However, he didn't immediately lie down, perhaps because of his current, dirtied appearance or for some other reason. Instead, he opted to sit on the chair in the room, gathering his thoughts as he recounted the events of the last few hours. For one, he was finally in a civilized settlement within the land of origin. No more barbarian-style survival for him. However, his biggest obstacle now was his lack of knowledge. The absence of a language barrier wasn't enough to integrate seamlessly into this world. But fortunately, it seemed he was on the right path. Then there was the monster deep within the forest. Though Michael hadn't faced it one-on-one yet, and had no desire to, given his current strength, he was almost certain that the creature responsible for the deaths of the night squad was the same entity he had encountered in that ruin. "It seems I've unleashed something terrible, but at least we can confirm a few things about it." He began listing what he knew so far. 1. It was a massive creature, tainted with the same airy tentacles he had seen on the controlled monsters. 2. It had the ability to control monsters. No, not just monsters, but also humans. And this control wasn't just a means of manipulation. It also appeared to be one of its primary ways of killing. Then came the real questions. What exactly is it? What was its history? And what connection did it have to that ruin? What are the limits of its mental control? How powerful did someone need to be to resist it? And just how many creatures could it control at once? Michael recalled his first encounter with a controlled beast, and then the hundreds of monsters floating in the air under its influence. Even if there was a limit, it was definitely not a low one. For someone like Mage, these two questions were crucial, one because of his duty to the kingdom, and the other because of the potential threat to its people. For Michael, it was far more personal. Then there was another question. Can that monster leave the forest? For Mage, the answer determined whether the nearby settlements would suffer catastrophic losses. For Michael, unlike the apocalypse in the outside world, something beyond his control, this disaster was entirely his doing. To a significant extent, he was responsible for the deaths caused by this creature. After all, it wouldn't have been released from the tower if not for him. Chapter 177 Interest in Cultivation. Michael felt a sense of responsibility and a pang of guilt. Aside from his personal issues with the monster, he wanted it dealt with as soon as possible. If only I could know that monster's level without having to risk my life. Knowing its strength would give him a much-needed advantage. For one, it would allow him to prepare more thoroughly, minimizing any potential gaps in his plan. But beyond that, another thought had struck him back in the mayor's office, one that could provide him with a surefire way to have more strength. His talent's evolution ability was directly tied to the strength of the creatures he evolved. The stronger a creature was before evolving, the more significant the transformation. Michael had a theory. What if he evolved creatures only at their peak of their potential? For example, he could take a goblin, something he could summon and dismiss at will, and evolve it into a hobgoblin. Then, by raising it to level 14, the upper limit for common rank creatures, he could evolve it again into a rare rank being. That alone might push it to the limits of a 1-star rare rank creature. Another evolution after that, and Michael was almost certain it would reach the mid-stages of rank 2. If he repeated the process, evolving the creature again, it could potentially push it to the very peak of rank 2. Michael couldn't help but feel that he had been using his talent inefficiently. But then again, he was still learning. Find your next read at My Virtual Library Empire. It was only natural that he'd take time to grasp its full potential. At least this method seemed far more cost-effective than trying to evolve Lucky, which required a staggering 625 evolution points. He had no idea how long it would take to accumulate that amount. If I don't see any changes when I try to evolve one of my human undead soon, since I'll be reach ing 100 evolution points in a few hours, I'll test this method instead. His mind buzzed. There were so many possibilities, but evolution points were always in short supply. If only I had treasures to increase my soul quality. Advancing ranks was said to bring drastic transformations, and from rank 2 onward, each breakthrough was supposedly more significant than the last. When I next visit the forum, I'll check for posts about the changes at rank 2. Even if I can only find scraps of information due to member-level restrictions, anything is better than nothing. It would be even better if I could find specialized info on necromancers. Though he was still a newbie, experience was slowly molding him into something more. Michael organized his thoughts and planned out his next steps for the next few hours. Once he was done, he noticed it was time to return to the real world. There was nothing left for him to do here except wait, which he considered a waste of time. Summoning two undead orcs by his side, Michael reconnected his consciousness back to his original body in Aurora. A moment later, his eyes opened in a dimly lit room. It's morning already, Michael noted. He had arrived at the land of origin in the dead of night, and after everything that had happened over the past several hours, it was only natural that Aurora, being nearly 4 hours ahead, was already seeing its dark skies lighten. Looking out through the open window at the slowly brightening horizon, Michael dismissed the undead in his room back to the netherworld. He stood up and made his way to the window, gazing at the scene beyond. The silence in the air almost made one mistake it for peace and quiet. But looking at the collapsed buildings and ruined roads outside, Michael couldn't help but think back to the events of the previous day. Feeling energized and unwilling to simply stay idle, Michael considered his options. He planned to visit the Supers Association today to speak with Brian, but it was still too early. Morning visits weren't an issue. He still intended to go as soon as possible, given that he had things to do in the land of origin. But there was a difference between showing up a little after 7 and arriving at 8, 9, or 10. In fact, he wasn't even sure he'd catch Brian at 10, let alone earlier. Not wanting to sit around, he quickly decided how to burn off some of his energy. Opening his window fully, Michael leapt out of his apartment, controlling his movements to land silently. Once on the ground, he turned back to glance at his apartment. A few of his undead were patrolling the area, but he paid them no mind. Crouching down, he gathered strength in his legs and propelled himself upward, landing smoothly on the roof of his building. Had a child seen him, they'd probably point in excitement and shout, "Mommy, look, it's Superman." Up on the rooftop, Michael took a brief glance at his surroundings before sitting on a concrete structure that resembled a box. He pulled out his phone, which he had taken before leaving his room. At first, he had planned to practice swordsmanship, but a different thought crossed his mind. For some reason, he found himself recalling the mages he had encountered in the past few hours. Though their strengths varied significantly, both the human mage and Mage Leon had demonstrated the full capabilities of magic users in their own ways. Spear training could be done at any time. For the first time in nearly a week since his awakening, Michael finally felt a genuine interest in trying out the methods of cultivation. He pulled out his phone and navigated to one of the first emails he had received from the association after his registration. The cultivation methods of a knight and a mage. The two most popular supernatural professions in Aurora. Chapter 178 Cultivation Systems. There were two main cultivation systems in Aurora, the knight and the mage cultivation systems. Under these two, several variations existed. Simply put, the knight path primarily focused on the physical aspect of supernatural power, while the mage path was more mysterious and energy-based. Explore more at my virtual library empire. There was a universal saying, all paths lead to the same end. This applied to the supernatural world as well. At the king rank stage, both knights and mages possess similar means, with only a few variations in prowess. A king rank knight had a stronger body, while a king rank mage, though physically weaker, had far greater energy reserves. This didn't mean one was inherently stronger than the other. Each had its own strengths and weaknesses. The way of the mage system is indeed different. Compared to the knight system, which Michael was more familiar with, the mage system remained somewhat elusive to him, despite his own magic-based class. The apprentice stage, rank 1. For a knight, cultivation began with passively accumulating mana into the body through breathing techniques. As they lacked the ability to manipulate this mysterious energy directly at this stage, they focused on condensing a life seed. This life seed formed in the heart region, and the process of creating one led to the strengthening of the body as a result. Before officially becoming a knight, the movements and training forms that followed a knight breathing technique did little to guide their mana. However, once the life seed was established, it acted as a supernatural organ, just like the brain, serving as a focal point for all things magical. At this point, the previously ineffective movements now played a crucial role, helping channel the accumulated mana to open acupoints through the guidance of the life seed. Acupoints acted as the body's natural limits. The more acupoints a knight opened, the more mana they could draw into their body, just like a container expanding its capacity. The number, type and location of acupoints opened directly influenced a knight's strength. Some knights were stronger, some were faster, and others had more resilient bodies. The breathing technique a knight practiced also determined their elemental affinity. Michael understood all of this after he became an awakener. Before his awakening, his knowledge of such advanced supernatural concepts had been limited. These were topics that weren't studied at his level in school. However, after awakening and gaining access to the supernatural forum, he had frequently come across posts about knights, unintentionally and intentionally deepening his understanding. The life seed was the foundation of a knight's power. It was also the key reason some talented individuals could awaken as knights as their second class when they became awakened as an awakener. Imagine this. If you had an organ designed to unlock the limit on the body that had always been part of you since birth, after awakening it becomes insignificant because awakeners, after all, could simply level up and allocate stats to grow stronger. As an awakener, you no longer have the limit of an ordinary man. However, for those with a life seed before awakening, the ability to unlock acupoints remained, allowing them to function like an awakener while still utilizing their innate method of power accumulation. Though different from the traditional path, this still resulted in significant strength. This was also why awakeners couldn't light up a life seed again. Though the acupoints still existed within their bodies, an awakener no longer had a defined physical or magical limit. Instead, they became something akin to a forever unofficial apprentice knight, capable of passively absorbing mana to enhance their physical abilities but unable to undergo the structured process of a true knight's cultivation. Without limits, the natural process of forming a life seed ceased to exist. Without a life seed, they also could not sense the location of these acupoints. This was the cultivation system of a knight, how they grew stronger and why one could also obtain it as a second class after awakening. Then, there was the mage cultivation system. Michael had later discovered that mages, like knights, could also be a second class obtained during an awakening ceremony. The difference was that while mages didn't need to ignite a life seed before awakening, they possessed something else that could carry over, a naturally opened acupoint. This was why it was often said that every mage could have been an excellent knight. Though rare, some individuals were born with an extraordinary affinity for mana. They didn't need to reach a higher rank to manipulate or sense it. Their bodies instinctively gathered it from a young age. Through this passive cultivation, some lucky individuals naturally opened one of the most crucial acupoints an elite knight, ranked a knight, needed to advance to commander rank. For knights, this acupoint allowed them to interact with mana directly and even cast spells like true mages. However, unlike knights, who opened acupoints that were spread throughout the body, a mage's defining acupoint was located in a far more delicate place, the brain. Mages naturally accumulated mana within their minds, but without a strong enough body and repeated advancement to reinforce their fragile internal organs. This made their path far more dangerous for others. Despite being as popular as the knight cultivation system, the number of people who originally started as mages was incredibly low. Even fewer knights ever switched to becoming mages after advancing to rank 3, as doing so meant abandoning their foundation entirely. Unless there was an exceptional reason, most wouldn't make the change. Mages possessed incredible versatility and numerous means to fight, but that didn't mean knights were weak. Knights had fewer techniques, but they were just as formidable in their own right. The acupoint that defined a mage, unlike a knight who had to open multiple acupoints to progress, was just a single, unique acupoint. Not all acupoints were the same. Some merely increased a supernatural's mana capacity. Others, however, were special. Opening them granted abilities such as elemental affinity or elemental manipulation. These acupoints were incredibly difficult to open for both mage apprentices and rank 2 knights. Awakening this acupoint granted them access to their sea of consciousness, a unique internal realm that was often called the Sequel of Consciousness, where the mana pool. Knights possessed mana reserves due to their life seed, but a mage's mana pool was exactly as its name implied. An advantage mages had over knights was that they weren't limited to a single affinity. This didn't mean they could wield all affinities, but unlike the knight cultivation system, where one's breathing method most times determined a fixed elemental path, pure mages could interact with multiple affinities as long as they had even a slight natural connection to them. The mage cultivation system provided by the association wasn't one that was created for the purpose to become a mage. After all, mages were either born with the talent or switched to after advancing to rank 3. Instead, what the association provided was a visualization method, a technique to enter the sea of consciousness, and a method to draw mana into to expand one's mana pool. This tied into another reason why Awakeners were considered special individuals. Even without opening the special acupoint, from the moment one awakens, the awakening of their sea of consciousness follows. This is also the reason why all Awakeners can cast spells regardless of their class. It was clear that the association had modified the cultivation manuals they sent to Awakeners. After all, most traditional cultivators had no use for this information. Michael's eyes lit up as he read further. It felt as if a new world had been opened to him. Suddenly, several things started making sense. After reading a bit more, he set his phone aside, a contemplative expression on his face. The Sea of Consciousness is a magical realm where a mage or rank 3 knight can absorb mana from the external world and to cast spells. In this space, as long as one's rank allows it, they can store spell models, pre-constructed spells that require no casting time. However, this method is highly mana-intensive, consuming reserves far faster than externally casting a spell using a bit of mana from the surrounding atmosphere. The more Michael organized his thoughts, the brighter his eyes became. Is this why Awakeners only need a thought to activate a skill? Could it be that our skills actually exist within our sea of consciousness? Michael wasn't entirely sure about this theory. After all, he still needed hand movements to cast spells, unlike the instantaneous casting described in the email. Maybe I simply don't have any spell models in my sea of consciousness. Michael recalled how the Awakener skill system functioned, how it always seemed to guide them. The instant casting described in the email reminded him of how spells worked in games. A single click, and the spell appeared. Curious about his suspicion, Michael didn't immediately attempt to check his sea of consciousness. Instead, he pulled out his phone once again, navigated to the Supers Association forum, and typed something he hadn't searched for before. Is there a difference between skills and spells for Awakeners? Chapter 179 Sea of Consciousness. Is there a difference between skills and spells for Awakeners? When Michael saw the search results, he wasn't too surprised. He had been slightly certain of his suspicion. As expected, directly seeking specific knowledge is far better than randomly gathering bits and pieces. This was one of the reasons he still saw the academy as a worthwhile goal, even if there was a high chance it didn't function exactly as its name implied. At the very least, he believed it provided structured knowledge about the supernatural world. Whatever its flaws, it had to be better than a public forum when it came to truly understanding the system. Skills are the external representation of a spell model. For traditional mages, this equates to a spell model that is not inscribed in their sea of consciousness. Spells, on the other hand, are the core spells of mages, the ones inscribed in their sea of consciousness that require no casting time. It is said that when an Awakener successfully inscribes a spell model, a new section appears in their panel. However, unlike skills, these spells cannot have their mastery increased artificially with the power of an Awakener. Their power depends mainly on the quality of the spell model, just like with traditional mages. Michael had always assumed skills and spells were the same. In a certain sense, he wasn't wrong, but he wasn't exactly right either. After reading more, he didn't end up favoring one over the other. Both had their own strengths and weaknesses. Continue your adventure with my virtual library empire. For one, skills could be influenced by an Awakener's stats, allowing them to improve with their overall growth. However, spells were purely dependent on the quality of the spell model and the properties of the caster's mana. Then there was the biggest advantage spells had over skills: instantaneous casting. The more Michael thought about it, the more he realized that spells inscribed in the Sea of Consciousness functioned like trump cards for both Awakeners and traditional mages. That said, the main method of casting magic still involved drawing spell models, commonly known as magic circles, using the caster's mana as fuel, with a little assistance from the surrounding atmospheric mana. The more Michael read, the more he understood. Finally, feeling he had learned enough, he eagerly set his phone aside. It was time. Time to check out his Sea of Consciousness. Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, following the visualization method described in the Mage meditation technique sent by the Association, he closed his eyes and focused. At first, there was nothing, just the faint hum of his own thoughts. But as he continued, a strange pull emerged from deep within him. Something stirred. His consciousness felt as if it were drifting, sinking into an unseen depth. A strange sensation washed over him, like plunging into endless waters, yet he wasn't drowning. And then, he saw it. A vast, dark space stretched out before him, its surface rippling like liquid starlight. This is my Sea of Consciousness. Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The Sea of Consciousness was said to be the summary of a supernatural. With it, you could know what elements one had, and so on. Due to Michael's low membership level, he would have seen things like laws also being able to be inscribed in the Sea of Consciousness. However, even if he did see something like laws and was intrigued by it, if he wasn't given more access to more information, he'd never know what it was. My Sea of Consciousness is filled with darkness. And oh, this strangely solid liquid I'm standing on. Does that mean I have the element of darkness and water? Michael wasn't sure. In the forum and in the meditation technique the Association sent, it said that it was better for one to do proper, accurate testing for their affinity. Just because he saw liquid in his Sea of Consciousness didn't mean it represented water affinity. It could just be there. Cases like this weren't rare. Among the two elements he suspected he had, Michael was more willing, or rather, he knew, he had an affinity with darkness. If not, he wouldn't have been able to cast an undead spell in the first place. Being an Awakener, though one could theoretically use spells from other classes, there were times when certain requirements had to be met. This also served as a limitation. For one, you could be a water mage and have the ability to use healing magic but still be unable to use light element healing magic, or could not cast a fireball like a fire mage. But for physical skills, you might even be able to use Berserk as a priest. Even in the Awakener's system, compatibility was a thing. Michael turned to look at his form in his Sea of Consciousness. He looked like a figurine of blue mass floating in the empty dark space. After giving his energy form a look, Michael turned his attention back to his Sea of Consciousness. Like I thought, there are no spell models here. Michael had expected this but wasn't too worried about the issue. Before he pulled his phone aside again, he had gone to the Super's online store to see if it was possible to buy the blueprints of spell models, and saw that he could. Though they were mostly basic, it was still something. After all, it wasn't only knights or awakeners in the forum. There were also mage apprentices and above that needed resources and information. Though Michael would very much like to start filling up this space with spell models, he wanted to try out the meditation method to increase his mana pool. The one the association had given was a no-attribute meditation technique that, though slow in increasing the mana pool in the sea of consciousness, which in turn strengthened and enlarged it, was a steady way for any mage with any affinity to start with or use. In the outside world and in the sea of consciousness, both Michael sat in a lotus position and started using the meditation technique. As Michael sunk deeper into meditation, he followed the breathing pattern outlined in the meditation technique. A slow inhale, a steady exhale. Again and again, he repeated the process, allowing his focus to drift entirely into his sea of consciousness. At first, there was nothing, just the same darkness and the strangely solid liquid beneath him. Then, something changed. A subtle pull. Michael barely had time to register before mana from the outside world began to flow toward him. It had no color, no form, just a formless, weightless force that slowly seeped into his sea of consciousness. The sensation was refreshing, like taking a deep breath of cool, crisp air after being in a stuffy room for too long. It wasn't overwhelming or forceful, but the speed of absorption was slightly faster than he expected. Michael's eyes, if he had any in this form, would have widened in mild surprise. This is different, he thought. The technique had described a gradual intake of mana, yet his body was naturally drawing it in at a slightly accelerated pace. It felt effortless, natural. As the mana merged into his sea of consciousness, he could sense a subtle shift, like a ripple expanding across a still pond. His sea of consciousness slightly more stable. Michael exhaled slowly, adjusting to the rhythm. Also, this difference in speed. It felt a bit faster than what was written in the meditation technique. Is it because of my strength? Michael felt that could only be the reason. When he opened his eyes in the real world for a brief moment, a panel appeared in front of him. You have learned no attribute mana cultivation technique. No attribute mana cultivation technique basic mastery, proficiency, 1.23%. A technique to access the sea of consciousness, strengthen it, draw spell models, and increase mana. At basic mastery, the speed of absorption is normal. I got a skill. Michael was a little surprised, but after a moment of thought, he calmed down. It made sense. After this, I should try my night breathing technique again. It didn't matter if he was going to continue with magic. Having the skill was nice. As a few thoughts flashed through his mind, Michael returned to cultivation. He had just checked his intelligence stat and saw no difference. So he decided to cultivate a bit more and see how long it would take before he started seeing the effects. If it took too long, he just switched to attempting to inscribe a spell model in his sea of consciousness. Whatever it was, he wasn't a traditional mage, after all. His mana pool was quite big. That was what Michael thought. But what he hadn't expected was that, in the pleasure of drawing mana into his sea of consciousness, he'd lose track of time. It wasn't until the sun laid its first grace upon the world, followed by the ding of a notification, that Michael finally pulled himself out of his cultivation state. The first thing his eyes met was a panel. Your intelligence has increased by 0.0001 point. Chapter 180 Return. The edge of Michael's lips twitched as he stared at the notification panel in front of him. He turned to check his status, but the panel didn't even bother adding the increase or showing any sign of such an increase. It was evident. The increase was way too low. I know it's a rankless meditation technique, but isn't this increase too low? Michael felt conflicted. He was happy that cultivation had indeed proven useful in increasing stats, but the increase was so small it almost made him shed a tear in pain. Just like spell models had ranks signifying their power and uniqueness, meditation techniques had ranks too. Among all ranks, one of the special ones was rankless, which either meant it wasn't qualified to have a rank or that it could be used at all ranks. It was clear which of the two the meditation technique from the association belonged to. I knew the association was a bunch of greedy people. He should have guessed it from the start. Since the rank wasn't mentioned in the meditation technique's content, Michael had figured it was a rankless technique. What he hadn't expected was for it to be the worst kind. He had thought the only thing he needed to buy when it came to magic was spell models. Now, it seemed like buying a hiring meditation technique had to be added to the agenda. I can't forget about getting it from the Supers Association due to my membership level, at least until I advance to rank 2. But with my mana pool continuing to grow, even after advancing to rank 2, I don't think even a master rank 4 in the Aurora cultivation system, technique will be able to increase my mana significantly in a stable yet slightly fast way. As for getting a king rank meditation technique, Michael didn't even consider it. He knew that after advancing to rank 2, it would take a long time to reach the next rank, so at that point, cultivation would be quite useful for him. Only a rank 5 meditation technique would provide the rapid pace he envisioned. However, knowing that meditating was at least working put Michael in a good mood. Even if the increase wasn't much, the calming pleasure that came with meditation was great. Still, this experience made him value his attribute points and the stat increases that came from leveling up as a human necromancer even more. Knowing it wasn't appropriate to cultivate any longer, Michael stopped. There were other things he needed to do. One was meeting up with Brian to see if there was any information he could gather, and the other was handling matters in the land of origin. However, due to getting carried away with cultivation, going to the association branch had to be put aside temporarily. The same went for discussing moving out with Aunt Mia. What Michael hadn't expected, however, was that when he returned to his room, Aunt Mia would coincidentally knock on his door, looking to have a conversation with him. The conversation was simple and short. Perhaps it was because Aunt Mia sensed that Michael seemed in a rush to do something. She had come to discuss possible places they could move to and wanted to know if Michael had any specific requirements. Stay updated via my virtual library Empire. Michael was more than happy to give his input. Not only did he trust Aunt Mia, but since he would still be the one choosing from the available options, it was better to leave the initial selection to someone like her. His requirements were quite simple: big city, big house, and so on. After saying what he had to say and sending Aunt Mia off with a few words, Michael excitedly closed the door to his room. He then went to sit on his chair and summoned the female undead he had previously summoned during his last visit to the land of origin. Giving the same command as before, he simultaneously used his senses to check on the other two undead in the house, not bothering to check what they were doing or thinking about freshening up first. Michael connected his consciousness to his body in the land of origin. A moment later, a pair of green eyes opened. The immersion was seamless. Then, a knock sounded at the door of his room. "Come in," Michael said as he dismissed the undead in his room to the netherworld. He had already used his senses to check what was beyond the door. Though he couldn't physically see what was on the other side, he could sense the vitality and mana of the person standing there. They were ordinary. Soon, the door opened, and a young lady in maid's clothing entered the room. "Good morning, my lord." "Good morning." Though his face remained relatively expressionless, Michael mentally sighed in relief. Had he been even a few seconds later, he might have missed the maid's call. It wouldn't have been a major issue, as he would have arrived only moments later, but he didn't want to draw any unnecessary attention to himself. It was still quite dark in the land of origin, So Michael was fairly certain this was the first knock on his door for the morning. Or at least, he hoped so. Sighing inwardly at the limitation of not being able to move in both Aurora and the land of origin simultaneously, he focused on what the maid was saying. "Sorry for disturbing your rest, my lord. But the mayor asked me to come and inquire if you would like to take your bath soon so my colleagues and I can assist you." As the maid finished her sentence, Michael thought he might have seen wrong when he noticed a faint blush on her face. However, he was more focused on something else. "Help me with my bath." "How?" "By preparing the water for you, my lord," the maid replied. "Boiling it if you prefer it hot, or adding ice if you prefer it cold.